You said it to her.
The new Peugeot 505 STX is such a refined, elegant, eminently comfortable place to be.
Back in 1958, French automaker Peugeot began exports to America, starting with the 403 sedan. Sales were slow at first, but started to improve by the 1980s, with models like the 505. However, their quirky cars would later be dogged by reliability issues, better Japanese competition, and a market presence so small that most Americans probably didn't even know how to pronounce their name, leading to their exit from the U.S. market by 1991, and a future return to America remains highly unlikely. This is a story of Peugeot and their attempts to sell cars in America. This is My Old Car.
Introducing the Peugeot 505 STX. Nothing else feels like it.
Thanks for all the suggestions to do an episode on Peugeot cars in America. All of your suggestions persuaded me to do this episode, since I admittedly don't recall ever seeing these cars here in the US as a teenager in the 80s. But their low numbers, along with the fact that I probably didn't recognize them back then, means that I needed to do a lot more research for this episode.
Dad, do the fish really jump out of the water here?
You'll see.
Before I get started, I'd like to thank Manscaped for sponsoring today's video, and for sending me their all-in-one Performance Package 4.0. Manscaped has all the best tools and liquid formulations for a guy's big three odor zones: your body and... Check out Manscaped's new Lawnmower 4.0 trimmer.
We've got Bush.
Their 4th generation electric waterproof trimmer with advanced skin-safe technology that reduces nicks and cuts on the most sensitive regions of your body.
My plums!
Also included is Manscaped's Weed Whacker nose and ear hair trimmer with the same skin-safe technology as the Lawnmower 4.0, so you don't end up like this guy. And best of all, the all-in-one performance package includes Manscaped's exclusive Crop Preserver Ball Deodorant for all-day body odor protection.
We've got balls.
And Crop Reviver Ball Toner Spray with cooling aloe vera.
Supersize my balls.
For a limited time, if you use my promo code OLDCAR, you'll get 2 free gifts: Manscaped's anti-chafing boxer briefs and the Shed travel bag. Go to manscaped.com today to get 20% off and free international shipping, plus 2 free gifts when you use my promo code OLDCAR at checkout. Do it today, before you end up like this guy. Now back to today's episode. So before I begin with some Peugeot history, let's talk about the company name itself. As I have done in some other episodes of car makes that are foreign to the United States, I have clarified how the name is pronounced. In America, I've typically heard it pronounced relatively closely to how it is said in French. So that is how I pronounce it as well, as Peugeot,
Peugeot.
with the emphasis on the second syllable. But if you are from the UK, and I suspect the same may be true for any country which was once a British colony, the emphasis is instead on the first syllable.
We've had word from Peugeot.
Was that done just to piss off the French? If you're a Brit, let me know. Not that Americans always get it right either, as we typically mispronounce a car model named after a French city famous for its 24-hour road race.
Safari and Le Mans models.
The S on the end should be silent, and as some of you pointed out in my Daewoo episode, I got it wrong too, but it's a hard habit to break. Although the first Peugeot models arrived in America in 1958, the company had started 100 years earlier by founder Armand Peugeot when they made steam-powered tricycles, and later they produced their first internal combustion car with a Daimler-built engine in 1890. This was followed up with their own produced engines by 1896, and by 1903, Peugeot produced half of the cars built in France. They even built race cars for the French Grand Prix in 1913. Following World War II, car production increased, starting with the 203 in 1947, which followed the Peugeot trademark of naming all of its cars as 3-digit numbers, with the middle digit always being a 0. Peugeot even had a patent on the 3-digit name with the middle 0, which forced Porsche into changing the name of their new for 1964 sports car, the 901. So what name did Porsche use instead? The 911. So if it wasn't for Peugeot, today we could be referring to Porsche's most famous model as the 901. Ironically, Peugeot never released a 901 model. In 1955, Peugeot began production of the 403, which was their first model exported to the United States, beginning in 1958. With a body design styled by Italian coach builder Pininfarina, 1 million of them were sold by the end of its run in 1962. However, in America, the most any sold in any one year was less than 16,000 in 1958. Despite the car's relative obscurity, many Americans would come to know the 403 many years later, thanks to its starring in the American TV series Columbo, which ran on NBC from 1971 to 78, and later in made-for-TV movies on ABC in the 1990s. And just like the show's titular character, portrayed by actor Peter Falk,
Want to wipe your windshield, sir?
No, that's all right. Don't bother. I can see through it.
Columbo's 403 was always a bit worse for wear, which often made the Peugeot execs back in France none too pleased. With the 403 being much smaller than most typical cars on American roads in the late 1950s, Peugeot followed it up with a larger 404, which began exports to America in 1961.
Oh, come on. It's a flat tire. I'm sure you know how to fix it.
It also offered a cabriolet, which cost $3,900 by 1965, making it a direct competitor to another more commonly known European import, at least in the US, the Jaguar E-Type. 2 years later, production ended on the 403, and although the 404 continued production until 1975, exports to America ended by 1970.
Back in the trunk. I'm kidding.
The 404's replacement in America in 1970 was the 504, which was a considerable redesign from the 404. Although it still had a Pininfarina designed body, it now had an independent rear suspension, giving it more of an air of sophistication than the typical American land yachts had back then. But it also had some quirks that Americans were not accustomed to, such as a left-hand ignition switch and a right-hand turn signal stalk. With the oil crisis looming in the early 70s, the options of a 2-liter gas engine or a 2.1-liter diesel should have been ideal, but the Japanese had cornered that market in the US by the mid-70s. However, Peugeot managed to eliminate one competitor in America, sort of, by 1974, fellow French automaker Citroën. Citroën was forced out of the American market that year for failing to comply with US regulations regarding the bumper height on their cars. But in a sense, that loss was a moot point, since that same year, Peugeot began a merger with Citroën, ultimately resulting in the formation of PSA. And what do the letters PSA stand for? Well, the P stands for Peugeot, but since I can't speak French, I won't try to butcher the rest of it. Instead, just show it here.
Une société anonyme.
4 years later, PSA would also merge with Chrysler of Europe. The 504 wasn't the only car Peugeot offered in America in the 1970s. There was the 304, intended as a slightly smaller option compared to the 504, but it was a slow seller, resulting in imports only from 1971 to 72, and are extremely rare to find in the US today. And in 1977, Peugeot began imports of the 604, a higher-end luxury car intended to compete with Mercedes-Benz, Jaguar, and BMW, with a price several thousand US dollars cheaper. But back then, owning a luxury car in America meant you needed the proper name to go with it, and despite the lower price, the Peugeot name didn't have the same attraction to US buyers as German and British luxury cars.
Because you don't get to be the second oldest car maker in the world by making second-rate cars.
Although thanks to its turbo diesel engine, which were becoming more popular in the early 80s thanks to being more fuel efficient, the 604 found at least enough buyers to last in America until 1984. In 1980, with imports of the 504 soon ending, Peugeot began offering the 505, and you could spot the early American spec versions thanks to their round headlamps, unlike the composite versions in Europe, which was due to the composite lamps not yet being legal in the US, and tried to promote the car with ads such as this one, comparing the 505 to French engineering marvels like the Concorde airliner and the TGV, the fastest train in the world back then. If you lived in New York City back in the early 80s, you may recall seeing the 505 as a taxicab. Although they tested the idea initially with the 504, Peugeot arranged a contract with the city in 1980 to provide the 505 as a taxi. Initially they got over 850 in service, with a goal of 1,200 cars in service by the end of 1981, or about 10% of all taxis in service in New York City. With its 2.3-liter four-cylinder diesel engine making just 71 horsepower, the 505 promised to save taxi drivers up to 40% on their fuel bills. But there was a catch. The Peugeot cost $13,000, which was $5,000 more than a Chevrolet Caprice taxicab back then, and repairs were far more expensive, assuming you could even find parts. The 505's smaller size didn't help either, since it could only fit 2 passengers. The contract dried up soon after, and Peugeot taxicabs were pretty much gone from New York streets by 1983. Despite the poor response as a taxicab, the 505, which also offered a 2-liter gas engine, would eventually become Peugeot's best-selling model in the United States, helping them to their best sales year of 20,000 sold in 1984. The 505 offered both a roomy sedan and wagon for a price that was comparable to the Mercedes W123 or the Volvo 740. But by the mid-80s, the 505 was the only model Peugeot offered in the US, and they had a far smaller dealer network as compared to Mercedes or Volvo. In 1987, Peugeot offered a special Liberté trim for the 505, named in honor of the centennial celebration of the Statue of Liberty. It was one of the most expensive trim levels for the 505, despite only having a 97 horsepower engine. If you wanted decent power, you opted for the 505 Turbo beginning in 1985, making 142 horsepower, which later reached a max horsepower of 180. By 1988, with only the 505 available in the US, Peugeot began exports of their 405 model, which was smaller and a bit sportier than the 505. Unlike the relatively decent sales of the 505, the 405, despite also being offered in sedan and wagon form, failed to live up to Peugeot's expectations, and ultimately became Peugeot's last new model to be sold in the US. Combined sales of both the 405 and 505 were only around 3,500 for 1991, resulting in Peugeot announcing its departure from America that same year. For 2.5 decades following their departure, the idea of Peugeot returning to the United States remained just a speculation that never took hold. That is until 2016, when Peugeot's parent company PSA announced they were considering bringing Peugeot back to the US by 2026. The idea gained even more ground in 2020, when PSA merged with Fiat Chrysler to become the world's fourth largest automaker, called Stellantis. With Fiat Chrysler already selling cars from Fiat, as well as Italian automaker Alfa Romeo in the US, adding Peugeot from the PSA group seemed like a natural conclusion, at least it did back then. But as of March 2021, Stellantis officially announced that Peugeot would not be returning to the US. By that point, with the overall automotive market already stressed thanks to the COVID-19 pandemic, Stellantis needed to reset its priorities, starting with substantially cutting back on its Fiat model offerings, with the Fiat 500X being the only model available as the start of 2022. Stellantis instead plans to focus more resources on Alfa Romeo, which has struggled to compete in the US with just two models, the Giulia and the Stelvio. I suppose it makes sense to go this route, since Stellantis can put resources towards saving a car make that is already here, as opposed to moving those resources to a new car make that may or may not find a market here, especially since Peugeot never had a significant market share in the US. They may have failed in America, but they are still a major player in France and the rest of Europe. But if you live in America and love Peugeot, sorry to say you'll just have to keep waiting. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, click the like button and subscribe to my channel.
Boy, you sure don't see very many more of these things around.
I got over 100,000 miles on it. You take care of your car, it'll take care of you.
If you once owned a car from the 80s to mid-2000s that you rarely see today and would like it featured in a future episode, leave a reply in the comments or contact me at the email shown here. See you next time.